Don Calloway, host of the Caucus Room podcast and CEO of Pine Street Strategies, along with Republican strategist Susan Del Percio and former Republican Congressman David Jolly. I'm happy to say here in studio with me, both of the latter, MSNBC political analysts. And I'm happy to welcome my Sunday family, but it's a serious Sunday, guys. So let's get to the reaction from you, first of all, David. Seth Moulton, you heard it all. What's your reaction to what he said?
I served with Seth. He's one of the more thoughtful, independent-minded members, and that's a good thing. He challenged Nancy Pelosi in 2018 for Speaker. He ran for president in 2020. This is somebody who's really following his own North Star, if you will. And so I think we're going to hear a lot of that from members on the Hill this week. But as he acknowledged, maybe after the Stephanopoulos interview, maybe there won't be too many voices. Here's my biggest takeaway about what we're about to see this week. And I say this as a House member, not about Seth. House members don't matter in this process at all. At all. Consider Donald Trump. Most of his cabinet has said they won't support him. His own vice president, Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House. The people far more senior than House members in Donald Trump's world have said he shouldn't run, and Donald Trump's not listening. Joe Biden's not going to listen to House members. I think Joe Biden has told us he's running. And if there was an opportunity for Democrats to reconsider this, it was during the primary. It really wasn't now. Look, we talked last week. I left unsettled from the debate. I really did. I'm concerned about our sitting president. But Joe Biden has said, trust me, I can do this. I think he deserves our trust, and we owe it to him to say, OK, we'll go with you. If Democrats are worried about the polls, it's a little too late. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've heard him say, and his family members say, Jill said it as well, we're not going to let 3.5 years be defined by 90 minutes in a debate. So that's the point from them. Don, your thoughts on this?
You know, David is right about a lot of things. Gosh, there's so many thoughts.
But not this.
Multiple interview. Well, let's start with the brass tacks. I think it's probably time for Joe Biden to step aside, given what we're seeing out of the national polls, as well as Democratic constituencies. Not House members, but Democratic constituencies across the country are very concerned about whether or not he can win. And I think that it's important to distinguish the Biden camp, Joe Biden's people who have held him up over the last 50 years of his political career. They are not the leaders of the Democratic Party. They are two very distinct camps. So I think the Democratic Party leadership, Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, the leaders in the Senate are going to have Jamie Harrison. They're going to have a real decision to make. And I would implore them to do it within the next week. And their decision supersedes that of the Joe Biden camp. I have a lot of problems with what Seth Moulton just said. David just said he ran for president, and that's true. So Seth Moulton absolutely knows how the delegates and the insider business of the Democratic Party works. So he absolutely knows that there is no mechanism to have some type of liberal Hunger Games to give the nomination to anybody other than Kamala Harris. And I'm going to have some real frustrations, Alex, with over the next 6 weeks with my fellow Democrats if you try to give it to anybody but the sitting vice president, because fundamentally we believe that the Biden administration has been successful. And if you believe that, then you have to believe that the vice president has been an integral part of that. She is the only reasonable nominee for the very real possibility that Joe Biden has to step aside.
Let me ask you, Susan, what you laid out before Biden's interview on Friday, the 9 things that he needed to do to quiet the doubters, that he must not mention jet lag or having a cold during the debate, but he said he had a cold. You also said he should speak directly and transparently about his health, which he arguably did not do. What kind of score do you give him?
At best, a D. I think he really failed the test, but he didn't completely fail it, in that he didn't have people feeling that much worse about his performance compared to the debate. But, I just want to go to what both David and Don said. I agree with David that 5 members of the House of Representatives don't change the equation, but 55 do. It opens up a window if there are a bunch of members who come out, especially from swing states. And the reason it matters is it's the narrative that is in the media. It's the narrative about Joe Biden. And here's one of my biggest concerns about Joe Biden, which I would say about all of us. None of us are always perfect. But going forward, every single move that Joe Biden makes, every single word is going to be held under a microscope. And there is no way any of us could survive that. And my concern is that I'm not sure how he's going to be able to campaign in 3 months if the last 10 days are any indication. He's not getting better with rest. I would say this, I hope that any Democrat who's looking for him to step down, any elected official, will wait until after NATO. I don't think we should undermine our president during the NATO summit. I think that's very disrespectful and it hurts the United States. So I think we're going to see that timing come into play. But I just don't know how Joe Biden survives this, especially the scrutiny going forward.
On that scrutiny point, let me just ask you, Susan, as the former Republican, on this panel, how is it that Donald Trump escapes that kind of scrutiny? What is it that he can lie blatantly and he can say things about, I don't know, batteries and sharks and have everybody clapping and saying, yeah, we want this guy for president?
Well, I'm still a Republican. I think David's the former Republican and is now an independent.
Oh, I thought you were reformed as well. Pardon me.
No.
You're not a Trumpian, that I'll say.
I have never been for Donald Trump, not one moment since he came down the steps in Trump Tower. I've been working against him since that day. But I will say this, I do know the people in my party and I know what they respond to. And most of it is fear. They're afraid of him coming after them. It's inexcusable. I can't tell you why they do this, in a rational term. But you're right. Donald Trump makes up lies, schemes, is a convicted felon.
I know.
And that's not enough.
All right.
And that's not enough.
All right. Let me ask you, Dawn, about Senator Peter Welch, who spoke with my colleague Ali Velshi today, saying the decision certainly was Biden's to make, and saying that responded rather to Biden, saying that he would drop out only if the Lord Almighty told him to do it. Take a listen.
Bottom line, this is not a decision for Lord Almighty. This is a real world decision for real world people in politics and who care about our country to decide what we think is the best path forward. And it has to be the best path to give us the best chance of keeping Donald Trump in Project 2025 out of the White House.
Is there something you can think of to say to Joe Biden that if the goal is just let's keep Donald Trump out of the White House, how do you convince Joe Biden that's what needs to be done? You need to step aside.
Joe Biden is a man of incredible integrity, very high dignity, and he cares about legacy and American history. The proper thing to do is to characterize him as an honorable character in the tradition of George Washington, in the tradition of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, as a Senate institutionalist, Joe Biden has tremendous respect for the legacy of LBJ. Hey, this was not my time. I am probably not the guy to carry us forward for the next 4 years, but I did an awfully good job of bringing this country together in the wake of the absolutely worst president.
So
and
legacy.
I will step aside now to give my legacy. I will give my vice president, who has been a part of my legacy, an opportunity to not become the first female president, not become the second African-American president, but to extend the legacy of what's right and defending this country from fascism, much of which is planning to be codified in Project 2025. The honorable thing, the righteous thing, and the legacy-preserving thing would be for Joe Biden to step aside and let the Democrats carry forward a new nominee.
Okay. David, quickly, we're going to take a look at some numbers. Here we've got the latest Bloomberg Morning Consult poll, all right? This one shows a very tight race. You've got Trump still leading in 5 of 7 key swing states, but only one, Pennsylvania, is outside the poll's margin of error, right? So this thing is tight. Trump leads Biden by 2 points in the swing states. It is the smallest gap since October, so that's been a while. But 55% say Biden probably or definitely should not continue his campaign. What do you make of the polls? And is it a good thing that he's not as behind as one would think he might be after the debate? I'm looking for some silver lining here.
Well, I think it speaks to our rigid partisanship in the country. We're deeply divided, and we perform as Republicans and Democrats. And look, largely the only people who beat Donald Trump in current polls, this snapshot, are Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, and Michelle Obama. Everybody else, Shapiro, Whitmer, and others still continue to trail. I think we're conflating a lot in this moment as a country. Questions of the president's fitness and questions of his polling. On fitness, you got two options. You can believe your eyes at the Thursday debate a week ago, or you can believe Joe Biden's word that he says he can do this. On polling, if the issue is polling, that's a question for Democrats to figure out if they want to replace their nominee. And I'd say there's two important dynamics. The one consistent reporting in all of this is that Joe Biden doesn't believe the polls, doesn't believe the pundits, doesn't believe, frankly, Democratic leaders across the country. He believes his gut, and he says, I'm not getting out of the race. That is critically important in this moment. And then the second, something that has not been talked about, the mechanics of replacing him.
Oh, yeah.
The piece that hasn't been talked about is Republicans will sue in virtually every state that matters. Not all 50 states, but they're going to sue the moment Democrats try to make this move to block access to the ballot of whoever.
Like it's a bait and switch or something?
Well, ballot access rules are state controlled.
Okay.
So they will choose about 20 states that really matter, and they will tie this up in the courts and go all the way to the Supreme Court before November to say you cannot replace Joe Biden on the ballot. They won't win many of them, but if they win a couple critical states, that matters to the presidency. So I'm not a Democrat, as I said last week. If you're going to replace Joe Biden because of the polls, there's a lot of work that's got to get done.
Okay. Well, you guys are my Sunday family, Republican, Democrat, Independent. I simply switch that. You're the Democrat, Dale. You know, as they go across the screen there. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. Good to see you all.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.